With due respect to the State Department, we're going to get started. And then when our last panelist comes, I'll introduce him. So good afternoon. I recognize this is the sleepy lunchtime moment, so we're going to do all we can to keep you all both educated and awake. That will be the indicator of success. My name is Mara Karlin. I'm the Director of Strategic Studies at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And I'm really excited to participate in this panel on Indo-Pacific security strategies. We have some tremendous panelists. Let me quickly introduce them. I'll ask a couple hard questions, and then I'll turn to you all, hopefully, for some more difficult and provocative questions. So first, we have Vice Admiral Linda Fagan. Vice Admiral Fagan is the Pacific Area Commander of the United States Coast Guard. I suspect she's the only person in this room who can confidently say she has served on all 7 continents during her 38 years of Coast Guard service. And she is the operational commander for Coast Guard missions all the way from the Rocky Mountains to the waters off of the east coast of Africa. So we're excited to have her. Next to her, we have Ms. Gayle Von Eckartsburg, the Director of the Pacific Division, Plans, Policy, and Operations over at Headquarters Marine Corps. She's been doing that since about 2015, working on lots of easy issues like policy, capabilities, force posture, and budgeting for the Marine Corps Asia-Pacific initiatives. So things like moving from Okinawa to Guam, the new presence out in Australia, Hawaii, all of that she's spending time on. And previously she spent time at InQtel in Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy. She worked in the State Department and the National Intelligence Council. Pretty sure there's nowhere in the U.S. government that she hasn't yet worked. We have, next to Ms. Von Eckartsburg, we have Mr. Joel Szabat. Joel is the Assistant Secretary for Aviation and International Affairs at the Department of Transportation. So he's doing everything in the air that you can imagine, negotiating agreements for our air carriers to operate internationally, licensing air carriers, working on air mergers, and he's also been the Executive Director of the Maritime Administration, and he has worked all across the Department of Transportation, working on issues like management and budget, aviation and international affairs, and transportation policy. And in perfect timing, we also have Mr. Walter Douglas. Mr. Douglas is a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs. He's been working in that role since about 2015 or so. And so he's the lead in state EAP on the Indo-Pacific framework, deals with public diplomacy, political military affairs, strategic planning, and foreign assistance. He has served in a number of sunny locales like New Delhi, Islamabad, Riyadh, and Cyprus, and we are very excited to have him here. So let me start off with a broad question. I'm going to start with Vice Admiral Fagan, and I'd like you all to tell us a little bit about how and in what ways you're thinking about Indo-Pacific challenges. You know, if we look at the national defense strategies, the national defense strategy that Secretary Mattis unveiled at my school in January 2018, he was talking about how we need a balance between competing with great power challengers like China, like Russia, while also preparing for conflict, preparing for the possibility of conflict. So tell us a little bit about how and in what ways you're striking that balance, and what are you prioritizing? Vice Admiral Fagan.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So just a little bit more context with regard to my role as the Pacific Area Commander and overseeing all of Coast Guard operations in the totality of the Pacific, also in both poles. And I know we just came from the panel before lunch where we talked about Arctic and some of the challenges we have there. But to scene set for you a little bit, I want to highlight that you know, the Coast Guard, we work for the Department of Homeland Security. We're a military force at all times. What's interesting about that is, so I don't work for Admiral Davidson at Indo-PACOM, but I am his Coast Guard component commander. You know, I provide Coast Guard forces to Indo-PACOM and PAC Fleet should they be needed in the region, and so sort of serve as a kind of principal planning official and have quite a bit of engagement with the team there in Hawaii. And so we talk about win before fighting. How do we collaborate short of competition and conflict. And the U.S. Coast Guard is uniquely positioned to do exactly that. Our authorities and access are nicely designed and attuned to help many of the small nations in the region, particularly in Oceania, with their own capacity to enforce their own EEZs and project their own presence into the region. I would tell you that the U.S. Coast Guard has never been more relevant. The demand signal for what we bring into this region has never been higher. In fact, at a recent meeting with Admiral Davidson, he looked at me and he says, I need more Coast Guard. So, well, I need more Coast Guard too. So the other thing that I would point out about the Coast Guard is we're not a garrison force. There is no Coast Guard in garrison. We're deployed and operating across the approaches to the homeland and frankly in many places around the world. And the readiness that we've got today is deployed and engaged across a number of mission sets, the Eastern Pacific and counter-narcotics, in the Bering, in the Arctic, and across our own national and homeland security interest. So, in this win before fighting, this is exactly where we come into play. We're very much aligned and in tune with the national security strategy, national defense strategies, where we talk about a free and open Pacific, rules-based Indo-Pacific that promotes peace and security and prosperity. If you heard Admiral Richardson's speech at lunch, he talked about how critical the sea lanes are in the Pacific. So one of the things that we've done recently, we've got a ship deployed right now under the OPCON and TACON of PAC Fleet, working in the Western Pacific. You saw it was in the news about a month and a half ago. We did a Taiwan Straits transit with the Berthoff. Also did some UN sanction enforcement with that ship. And now she will continue on, and the ship that comes after her will be more focused then in Oceania, where we can do several things. And one of the things, again, is modeling legitimate at-sea behavior so that China Coast Guard can see what a responsible Coast Guard looks like and acts like at sea. And conduct search and rescue exercises, and then, again, with small teams, touch some of the small ocean or small nation countries in Oceania in a way that helps them build capacity and generate their own ability to self-help. And so that's where our role as a law enforcement or regulatory agency become pretty critical in the region. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really helpful. For those of you who've been hearing about this idea of gray zone conflict, it seems like the Coast Guard is perfectly positioned to engage in that in a responsible way. That said, for those of you who are trying to figure out what exactly do we mean when we talk about competing with China, the Defense Department hasn't actually defined that yet. So there's some good work to be done there. Ms. Von Eckartsburg, could I ask you to also tell me a little bit about how you're conceptualizing Indo-Pacific challenges?
Sure. And again, thanks for everybody here on the panel and you all. This is a great crowd. I was here last year, and you guys have knocked the ball out of the park in terms of participation. So great to see you here. So for the Marine Corps, maybe we were just talking before, there's a lot of similarities with the Coast Guard in the fact that we're always ready to go, always forward deployed, always ready to fight. So I think if you're thinking about the Marines in the Indo-Pacific, you have to think about them first and foremost in that context of always ready. And when I first came to the Marine Corps about 8 years ago, I really had to think hard about what that meant. And what it really meant was that you're ready, not just ready to go, but you're ready now, and you're ready to respond and compete, and then if necessary, you'll be ready to go to war and win. And so you put that over the layer of forward presence and a consistently persistent forward force, then you basically have a sense of how the Marine Corps is posturing itself in the Pacific. So the word garrison is also not a word that you hear very often in the Marine Corps. In fact, whereas there's about 40,000 Marines worldwide who are constantly in this state of persistence presence, constantly retaining readiness, constantly engaging, constantly training. The vast majority of those are in the Asia-Pacific region. More than 25,000 of those are west of the international date line. And so when you talk about those Marines, it's not that they're sitting in Okinawa waiting for something to happen. They're in a constant state of motion around the region, whether in the Philippines or in Thailand, in Guam, in the seas surrounding Japan or in Korea, they're in constant state of motion. So the balance that you asked about, how we strike that, we strike it sort of by doing, leveraging presence to maintain readiness and to maintain and training to maintain the readiness at the same time. And certainly there are costs to that, but that's fundamentally how the Marine Corps operates.
Great, thank you for sharing those thoughts. Mr. Szabat, you have a little bit of a different perspective, I suspect. Tell us a little bit.
Yeah, it's always difficult speaking after the Coast Guard and the Marine Corps. I come from a civilian agency where we are also always ready to ask for more information before we make a decision. So I think Mr. Douglas and I will split a bit the duties of the perspective of the Indo-Pacific strategy as seen through the eyes of our civilian government agencies. I think the first thing is, for those of you who remember the Brady Bunch, there was one famous episode where the younger sister was complaining that everybody only paid attention to her older sister, and it was always Marcia, Marcia, Marcia. Well, often when we talk about Indo-Pacific strategy, we say China, China, China. So one of the things from the administration's perspective is to remember that this is not about containing or encircling any one country, but rather sustaining the free and open order under threat from aggressive and predatory behavior from anyone. Now, from the military perspective, you have to look at the near-peer competitors and what the biggest challenges are. But from the overall government perspective, we're saying we want our Indo-Pacific strategy to be something where we're helping people regardless of who our competitors may be or where the threat may be coming from. Right now, look, I'm an old Army cavalryman. I served in the East-West German border protecting the Fulda Gap. Back then, we worried about we had an arms race, we had missiles races. Right now, Indo-Pacific strategy, we're having an infrastructure race. Who can do the most to help countries build their infrastructure? That's not a bad race to be in. Mm-hmm. So our vision, the U.S. government's vision for the Indo-Pacific strategy has three pillars: economics, governance, and security. For the economic piece, as you might expect, this is the forefront of the vision, and we're looking for private sector-led rather than state-dominated investment, because that's the kind of investment that will actually help and not hurt hurt governments and countries in the long run. Secondly, on the governance perspective, is to promote good governance, because without good governance, you cannot attract that private sector investment. And then third is the security commitments, is that in order to assure the free flow of commerce, we have to have the correct security arrangements with our allies, with people who want to be our friends and want to be our allies. And on that, I'll defer more to our colleagues from the Coast Guard and from the Marine Corps.
Great, thank you for that perspective. And Mr. Douglas, we're delighted to have you. If you could tell us a little bit from your perspective, how is state thinking about Indo-Pacific challenges? While the military may be debating this issue of competing with China or preparing for war with China, what does that look like from a diplomat's perspective?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, and I'm sorry about being late. I now know there are 2 convention centers in Washington. At any rate, what I do is, and Joel, thank you very much, because he gave you the 3 parts that we have of economic governance, security. I do economic and governance, and I go overseas and speak a lot about this with foreign audiences. And the key thing is, as Joel said, is we have private sector investment. So what does that mean? How does that translate? What's the dynamic here? Just a couple of figures. I don't want to bore you too much, but basically the Asia Development Bank estimates that there's they need about $1.7 trillion in infrastructure funding in the Indo-Pacific. There's nowhere near that money out there, and no state, no government can ever meet that. So it's the need to attract private sector investment. There's about $70 trillion sloshing around in money centers and in corporations, be it London, be it New York, be it Hong Kong, Tokyo. And our idea is to get that money to come into the Indo-Pacific. The problem is that as you look at it, the investment is very unevenly distributed. If you take American FDI in the region, foreign direct investment, just American alone, you find we have about $1 trillion this year in that FDI. The problem is it all goes Japan, Korea, Singapore, Australia. So what we want to do is make it so not just those 4 countries, but all the countries receive FDI. And therefore, we have set up programs dealing with digital economy, energy, and infrastructure to help them open up their economies to, say, end some of the problems they've had. For example, in 2017, AID had a project with the government of Vietnam, And Vietnam in 2017 was rated 88th in the ease of doing business, and 82nd, and down from the top, not very easy. After simply a year of working with experts that we brought in, they eliminated about 180 various investment laws or changed them, and the next year Vietnam went up to 68 on the list. So that's quite a jump in a very short time. And so what we're trying to do is we want to replicate that, systematize that across the region so that the region can attract more FDI and is not as lopsided as it is today. Governance is absolutely essential to everything we do. The Vice President announced the Transparency Initiative at the APEC meeting in New Guinea in November, and talked about a $400 million Transparency Initiative program. And the reason we need this is that we've seen what happens when there's secret deals. Money gets spent in the wrong places, debt levels increase. The Western press, I would especially point to states like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Financial Times, have done an incredibly efficient job of showing what happens when secret deals are made. We can't have that. We need open governance. And that means that you have to see that those investment laws, that the way that private sector can go in, that it's open, it's transparent, put your money in, you get it out, all the investment laws are very clear cut. And so that's why governance is an absolutely essential part of the economic programs we have going forward. I'll stop there. Love to answer questions later.
Terrific, thank you. All right, so the next question is a two-parter for our first two panelists, and then a one-parter for the next two. So for the first two, tell us a little bit about how your service is investing in and conceptualizing force management and force development in the Indo-Pacific. Effectively, how's the Coast Guard and how are the Marines building and using their force in a way that makes sense in the Indo-Pacific? And then the second part of the question, which gets to hit you all at the end, tell us about how you're working with allies and partners, right? We know that this is the United States' comparative advantage. No one else has, such an unparalleled network of allies and partners. Talk to us a little bit about how they really kind of factor into your thinking. Vice Admiral Fagan.
Okay, thanks. So, again, sort of the high-level approach is rules-based maritime governance, helping others ensure their own self-governance, providing economic security, and then kind of being a counter to China. And so I shared with you that the demand signal for the Coast Guard has never been higher. We've been in the region all along and are invested in the region now. From a force laydown standpoint, we've got two national security cutters, and I'll have 3 of the fast response cutters in Hawaii. We've got personnel in Guam, another group of people at Yokota Air Base, primarily doing U.S. Ship inspections and port security investigations. We've got people in Singapore as well, small numbers. We have liaison officers and attaches around the region that really provide a lot of access, so liaison officers in Fiji, the Philippines, Korea. We have an attaché, fairly newly established attaché in China, has been there just coming up on a year now. One in Japan. We have a maritime advisor in Vietnam. So those individuals, one in each of those countries has been very helpful as we think about how we're investing in the region. I shared with you the ship deployment we've got going on right now, the Coast Guard cutter Berthoff, one of our national security cutters. And that ship, we chose the port calls very intentionally to partner, kind of the second part of the question, to collaborate and partner with some of the nations in the area, but also to do search and rescue exercises and demonstrate joint and interoperability. A forum that is worthy of a little bit of discussion here, and just to make you aware of it, is the North Pacific Coast Guard Forum. This is a forum that came into being in 2000. There's also a North Atlantic Coast Guard Forum. The countries that participate, in addition to the U.S., is Canada, China, Japan, Russia, and the Republic of Korea. And it meets annually, brings together, there's experts meetings in the intersessional, and then there's a senior level meeting annually. And what's interesting, I attended the meeting last fall, hosted by China. And then had bilateral discussions with each of those countries, and we're able to coordinate and collaborate on shared interests like search and rescue, like countering IUU fishing, We had previously signed a MOU. This MOU is going to expire here in a few months, where we would take Chinese shipriders on one of our Coast Guard ships, and in fact had a substantial interdiction last summer of a Chinese fishing vessel that was caught, fishing illegally, high seas drift net fishing illegally, and we're able to do that with in cooperation with the Chinese. So I think the way I would characterize what we're doing from a force management standpoint, we do have small footprint of people in ships that are in the region, where we're able to think more nimbly, I'll use the term force project, but just engage with some of these small nations, are things like military training teams, where 3-4 people go in and help train a nation's Coast Guard on how to do law enforcement boardings, fisheries boardings. And so that's kind of where our conversation is right now, with some reliable funding and resourcing. What might the right kind of small package with people with authorities and access, where they might be able to provide a very useful counter to some of the activity that we see from China in Oceania. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Ms. Von Eckartsburg, tell us where the Marines are on this.
Right. So I'll address primarily this idea of force development and partners and allies. So with force development, I'm told that in the CNO's talk, he had a great slide, right, which showed the Asia-Pacific region, that showed not only the importance of it in terms of population and economic activity, but then also contrasted sort of the World War II, how the U.S. executed war and dominated in World War II as compared to today in the thrust of China, whether it was south. Did you all see that slide? Yeah, apparently it was very telling. And if you look at that slide, I think it's pretty clear that you need to have a maritime force. You need to have a force that can operate seamlessly between land and sea. And so that's certainly where the Marine Corps comes in. I'll say it that I think that the Marine Corps' natural environment is the Asia-Pacific region, and we're, and I will say this too, I think uniquely capable of operating effectively, not only sort of in historic roles, but also in future emerging roles. And if we think about how is the Marine Corps adapting to address this new competition with China, to posture as outlined in the NDS. The NDS is a brilliant document, and it said it fairly clearly, which is the Marine Corps will operate as the inside force, that the contact and the blunt force, that we're going to hug the enemy, that we're going to be there first. We're going to operate at this level below armed conflict. We are going to be there operational. So how are you going to do that? Well, back in this transformation for the Marine Corps started back in 2016, where we came out with the Marine Corps operating concept. And if you haven't read that, I urge you to have a look at it. It's very telling, where the Marine Corps actually said right up front, we're not organized to do this. We need to change. And so the Marine Corps has been moving out in that direction to adjust through all of the methods of force development to create a Marine Corps that is effective in this new environment. Some of the things that emerged from the MOC, the Marine Corps operating concept, is a thing called LOCI, which I'm sure you've heard of, and then also EABO. And LOCI means literal operations in contested environments, and EABO is advanced expeditionary advanced base operations. So you look at those two terms, and that pretty much describes how the Marine Corps expects to operate. So we today are engaged in aggressive wargaming, training, and exercises to test out and refine these concepts for the Marine Corps to prepare the force to operate in this way. I'll transition. When you think about EABO, one of the key things is as you're executing your training and these operations in the Pacific, say for example in and around the Philippines, your mere presence, the mere activity that you have is reassuring to those partners and allies in the Philippines. And so again, we're using this engagement as a way to advance the overall goals as we continue to develop the force. I could go on about EABO, but I'll shift a little bit to partners and allies. So, and I'll talk primarily about Japan. You know, one of the strongest, most important allies that we have in the Asia-Pacific region. And the Marine Corps works very, very closely with the Japanese military on a number of fronts. As you all know, the Japanese have acquired the MV-22 aircraft. They've put in a bid for 147 F-35s. So the Marine Corps is leaning in hard over multiple years, and the Marine Corps is standing by their side to assist. The Japanese are also standing up their own amphibious capability, and of course the Marine Corps is there to assist with training and helping them develop that capability. And finally, another investment, a very big investment that not only the Marine Corps but the Department of Defense and the United States is making is in Guam and the realignment of Marine forces from Okinawa. And that investment in 2012 dollars is about $8.7 billion, and it is well underway. In effect, creating a new capability, a first time in more than 60 years, a new Marine Corps sort of facility on the island, the U.S. territory of Guam. So that's an enormous investment. And it's also a gesture writ large for the Department of Defense with a recognition of the importance of the Western Pacific, as the Admiral referenced. It's a very strong gesture, not only in the U.S. commitment to the region, but also, if you will, to send the message to China.
Great, thank you so much. And I particularly want to foot stomp this comment you made about the Asia Pacific being the natural environment for the Marine Corps. Makes a lot of sense, but for the last 18 years, that actually hasn't been primarily where the Marine Corps has been focused. So they are undergoing a profound transformation.
And actually, and Doctor, if I can pick up on that.
Please do.
Because I want to speak a little bit about the force management on the sea lift and the airlift side as well. In peacetime at least, the Department of Transportation has the responsibility of working with the U.S. Transportation Command, and we're their coordinating arm to the civilian airlift and sea lift capacity. In the event of a military conflict, 90% of our logistics are going to move by and through civilian vessels and on civilian aircraft. We are also, within the Department of Transportation, the Maritime Administration is responsible for managing much of the Navy, the military sea lift capability. So, if there's a conflict, we have a high degree of confidence that the Navy, with the pre-positioned vessels, will be able to move that equipment, the stuff Diego Garcia, Okinawa, Guam, and the soldiers and Marines that go with it, quickly into a conflict area. But the rest of sustaining a battle means getting supplies and getting the remainder of your forces from CONUS to wherever the battle is. I used to serve in the European theater. That was a challenge, but crossing the Pacific is 4 times as difficult in terms of logistics and supplies as crossing the Atlantic. It's a much bigger challenge. And for that, we have challenges, especially on the sea lift side. And I just want to kind of underpin what some of these are, because these are the challenges that we have to do as far as force management and force development if you're going to sustain the military with sea lift and airlift over a long period of time. The first is that our sea lift is old. So when I became the Executive Director of the Maritime Administration 8 years ago, there was a consensus, TRANSCOM, the Military Sea Lift Command, the Maritime Administration, this fleet needed to be recapitalized. It was on average over 30 years old. 8 years later, the fleet is about 6 years older than it was before on average. So that recapitalization need is greater than it was before. Our colleagues in the Coast Guard are constantly inspecting our vessels and pointing out that they have increasing shortcomings and are not able to do the mission as well as they were before. So that's number one, is just the age of the fleet. Secondly, is the size of the fleet. Again, what the Navy has for pre-positioned vessels, they believe are fine for that initial deployment. But for the surge of forces from the U.S., for what we would call small or moderate scale warfare exercises, it's adequate. Okay, for large scale, for the maximum deployment that our military is built for the number of divisions of Marines and soldiers we have stateside, for the Air Force personnel equipment that have to be moved by ship, it is not adequate to move and sustain. We don't have the mariners, we don't have the U.S. flagged merchant marine that we need for that purpose. The third point, something we've already talked about, Dr. Karlin was just alluding to with the Marines, is the positioning. Our small U.S. flagged commercial fleet is by and large not plying the waters of the Pacific, certainly not in the numbers that we would need for them to be readily available in the event of a conflict. And then fourth and finally, and this one gets a little bit out of my lane, and if there was someone from the Navy, I would defer to them. Again, back in my Army days, in 1980s, cavalry scout at the Fulda Gap, behind us was a large fleet of commercial vessels escorted with over 100 frigates, dedicated escorts for those merchant vessels. Today, the U.S. Navy has exactly 0 dedicated escorts for our merchant marine to sail these ships across the Pacific. We are not able to move our logistics according to war plans unless we have cooperation from our allies. By statute and by National Security Presidential Directive, we are supposed to be able to provide sea lift with U.S. ships and U.S. mariners without relying on allies. But we can't do that unless we have the escorts or unless we choose to only engage where we do not have enemies with the capability to strike our logistic chain. I don't think that's the strategy that we're striving for in the Pacific.
Thank you for just bringing us all down. I appreciate that. All right, Mr. Douglas, the coin of your realm is allies and partners. Tell us a little bit about how you're thinking about them as you look at Indo-Pacific security strategy going forward.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm glad that's the first question because we couldn't do what we do without our allies and partners. They're absolutely crucial to everything the United States does. And it's not just military deployments, it's a similar outlook on the region. How we're going to be, I got it louder. How we're going to, we share a vision when we talk about open, transparent, rules-based. When we go to our allies and partners, they say the same thing. It's very interesting. On March 20th in Jakarta, the Indonesian government hosted 18 nations of the East Asia Summit to come together to talk about the Indo-Pacific. 16 of those, and that includes the United States, Australia, Japan, ASEAN countries, all that. We all pretty much shared a vision. Think of the Venn diagrams. When we were schoolboys, a lot of shaded area there. There are only 2 outliers, Russia and China. They had different visions for what the region is. But we don't exclude them. We want them to be part of the vision that we have and that our allies and partners have. It's very, very important that this is something that works for everybody. And that's why when we call it a strategy, maybe it's better to see it as a framework, a vision, something like that, because it's really open to all countries there. But as getting back to that, with allies and partners, when we go there, when we have meetings with them, it's interesting how much we share the same outlook about what's best for the region. And we're countries that can share our ideas, share our infrastructure development, share our digital achievements with the rest of the region to help them become much more integrated and become powerful forces in sub-regional groupings like ASEAN, which is absolutely central to our effort.
Great, thank you. Okay, so for my last question, before I turn to y'all, I'm going to actually start with you, Mr. Douglas, and go this way because Vice Admiral Fagan has already gotten it twice. So Winston Churchill has this quote. He says, however beautiful the strategy, you should occasionally look at the results. So I want us to spend a moment on results. The Obama administration in 2012 said, Asia-Pacific's the future, right? You all remember the Defense Strategic Guidance? Then we have the Trump administration, 2017, with the National Security Strategy saying, it's all about Asia. 2018, the National Defense Strategy saying, great power competition / preparing for great power conflict, which was code word for China and Russia, obviously. So for now, a decent chunk of time, right? Since 2012, effectively, you've had multiple administrations saying, this is what we need to focus on. And inevitably, if we're going to do that, it means we're not focusing on other things. So what I'd like to push all of you is tell us a little bit about what are you not doing because of this increased focus on Indo-Pacific affairs, and what might change it? Is this the war in Venezuela? Is this Middle East purgatory? What will suddenly make you stop and say, our lodestar was Asia-Pacific, we were most concerned about China, but you know what? Just like 9/11 took the country in a very different direction, what might change that? Mr. Douglas, a softball for you to start with.
Well, first of all, I deal with East Asia Pacific region, so I can't really compare it to all these other things that are going on elsewhere. But I think what is significant is this recognition, and our Secretary Pompeo speaks about it. We've seen our colleagues across the government, is a recognition that we really need something new in the region, that we need an Indo-Pacific, not just an East Asia strategy, and that bringing the countries of South Asia in is absolutely crucial to what we do. India is very much a partner in everything we do and is essential to the Indo-Pacific as we move forward. And so I think what the big changes, I can't say what we're not doing, but what I can say is what we are doing. And that is we're having this common vision, putting resources behind it, and I expect that to continue. We never want to promise resources until they actually are delivered, but I think the indications are pretty good that we're going to be doing more. I don't want to discount some of the earlier things. I think if you look at, say, Rebalance, we've evolved from there and built on it to create something much larger. Rebalance was largely about what we, the United States, were doing. Indo-Pacific is really a vision for our allies, partners, for the whole region, in fact. So what we see is this enlarging focus in the region, and that's the big change.
Great, thank you so much. How about you, Mr. Szabat?
So I agree with both President Obama and President Trump that the future direction continues to be in the Pacific. I mean, if there's a challenge, it's moving enough focus and enough direction from everything else that we're doing towards the Pacific. But I don't see, in the near-term horizon at least, things that would have us pull back. It's just the center of gravity worldwide is just so much in that South Pacific area, or actually North Pacific to East North Pacific to East Asia. You've got over half the world's population, the fastest growing economic centers, and as Walter just mentioned, we're not just looking at the challenge of China, but right behind it will be the growth of India. And you've got so many other countries that we haven't thought of so much in strategic terms that will become even more important going forward. We had a team of people go out to Vietnam just this last fall. The Vietnamese government, understandably, is desperately searching for support for infrastructure development. They want to build a highway from Hanoi down to Ho Chi Minh City. They want help with developing their ports, LNG infrastructure, and most of all, they don't want to have to rely on the Chinese. You're going to have a lot of that coming out of Asia and South Asia. And the first place they're going to look is to those of us here in the United States that have the technical expertise to assist them. So for us, I think the biggest challenge is not so much, is there something that's going to help focus us away from Asia? It's how much time and resources do we have to pull away from what we're already doing and devote additional time and resources to Asia.
Absolutely. Great, thank you. What about the Marines?
Right. I'm kind of in the same boat as Mr. Douglas here, since I live and breathe Asia Pacific all the time. It's hard to imagine what's outside my bubble. But I should say just broadly for the Marine Corps looks at, delivers a global capability. And so when we're looking at force management, it's a global force management. And so we're continually trying to balance the demands of a globally distributed force. And so, as I mentioned, there's 40,000 Marines at any one time that are moving around the world. 23,000 of those are west of the international date line, so they're in the Pacific, and they've never left. They've been there since the early 80s in the Pacific. And so, and then you have your Marines in Hawaii that brings that number over 30,000, and the rest are distributed across other places in the world. So the tension for the Marine Corps is supporting those Marines with naval lift, and we have an enduring gap in lift capability for the Marine Corps. So that's the real challenge. How do you balance that lift capability to support your forces where they're demanded most? And then these initiatives from the Joint Staff about dynamic force employment and your ability to move rapidly those forces where to be unpredictable around the world and within the region. That's another stress onto the Marine Corps. How do you balance limited resources to support all of this activity? That's really, it's less about, that Asia Pacific is pulling in all our resources. It's more about maintaining a global capability with limitations that are outside the Marine Corps, right? So that would be it.
All right, thank you. Vice Admiral Fagan.
Okay, so, I shared with you in my last comment sort of some of what we are doing in the region. The way I would characterize this, it comes down to capacity, capability, and funding. As an operating agency within the Department of Homeland Security, the Eastern Pacific and the counter-narcotics effort is absolutely job one for us. 79% of the drug flow comes directly towards Mexico. We're engaged every day interdicting cocaine at sea, and it just consumes a lot of resources for us. On a Homeland Security front, we're search and rescue agency. We generate presence in and around the approaches to the United States. We're a law enforcement agency, and we do that for our homeland. That again consumes quite a bit of our capability and capacity, and then the Arctic. Our ability to force project into the Arctic. The great news is, if you heard the commandant this morning, we have awarded the contract for a new polar security cutter to VT Halter. My very first tour in the Coast Guard was on the Polar Star. That ship was commissioned in 1976, and it was old when I was on it, and it is old now. We can't get that polar security cutter into the inventory quick enough. The Commandant published a op-ed piece. I think it was either yesterday or today, and it talked about, I think, particularly for this group, it's worth just a little touch on what the challenge is that is the Coast Guard budget. Because a budget is either defense or non-defense, and we sit in that non-defense pot of money. We're over on the Homeland Security side, and because of some of the budget control caps and other caps to the budget, we have seen an erosion in our buying power since 2012. So, as we've embarked on the recapitalization of the new assets, our ability then to do the other things has gotten squeezed to a point where it's really becoming untenable. We have a $1.7 billion backlog in shore infrastructure, right? Ships don't stay at sea forever. You've got to have a place to tie them up. And at the same time, the funding support that we get from DOD has been capped out about $340 million annually. We probably contribute closer to $1 billion in effort a year directly to DOD. So I share that with you because, as they say, we want more Coast Guard. We need more of you forward deployed in Oceania. That support, that money support, ship support, Navy ship support into the Eastern Pacific, that needs to come in order to then free up some of the Coast Guard big ship capacity in particular. We've got an incredible set of authorities. We get access to countries that the U.S. Navy may not. But finding relief in those other primary mission areas and finding some reliable, predictable
to keep up. Plus, by every measure of performance, the sailors we have today in the Navy are the smartest and most capable, most physically fit, the best looking, most charming group that we've ever had. This is a really very smart cadre, right? So yeah, give them a round of applause. Eh? Okay, sir.
Thank you for sharing your perspectives with us. If there's one thing that you might want to fix or enhance in your programs today, what might that be?
Yep.
And if so, is there anything that this group could help you in achieving that goal?
Well, I'm a huge team player, and I see that there are just so many terrific ways that we can team together. So Dr. London asked if I could sort of get at one thing, what might that thing be, right, to fix? And I will tell you that, and I will just riff off of Secretary Lord, who got us started this morning at breakfast. We have got to get capability into the hands of our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines faster, okay? And more and faster. right? So I use this chess analogy a lot, so I apologize if you've heard it before. But if I was to play Garry Kasparov for 1,000 games in chess, the score, the tally at the end of that would be 1,000-0 Kasparov, okay? It would just be that straightforward because Kasparov is so much better trained than me. He's a better chess player. And if I asked him to take his bishops and knights off the board and maybe his rooks and then play it'd probably still be 1,000-0 Kasparov because he's that much better. But if I get Gary's queen and maybe half of his pawns, it starts to look like, I could take a game from Kasparov, right? Material matters. Mr. Kasparov is an exquisitely talented chess player, way more than me. But at some point, material overcomes all of that. And so I get worried when people say, hey, CNO, don't worry about a thing. It's good. Our sailors are so much better trained than theirs. Well, that's the margin that's far too close for my comfort level, okay? We need to make sure our sailors never go into a fair fight where we're relying on training. Or, don't worry, CNO, our sailors our culture, our people are so much more innovative than the adversary. Okay, that may be true, far too close of a margin. We need to get capability, decisive capability, into the hands of our forces faster, okay? And we all need to lean into this. And we're creating, as Secretary Lord said, it is not a matter of authorities. DOD 5000 could be better, but it is not an inhibitor. This is a human bias, right? And we need to just lean into this because I think it's one of our biggest strategic Achilles heels. We can get this done together if we team together. We're having those types of conversations, right? So we all need to lean into it. Sir.
CNO, as you reflect over your first, Charles Dupard, as you reflect over your last 4 years, if you had to do it all over again, what 3 things would you do differently or change?
3 things?
Yes, sir.
It's like a 10-page essay or something. No, I don't know. I don't know that I would look back and, it's a hypothetical situation. We had a great discussion about what it means to command this morning. And I hope that in hindsight, for those scenarios that face all of our commanders, the most that we can ask for them is that they are, they're experts at what they do, and that they understand their responsibilities and their accountability, and that they use their authority to get the maximum effect, right? When in command, command, okay? Use all the authority that you get. Do not be timid. And so I guess if there's any kind of looking back that I've done, I hope that people will say that the whole team, right, used these 4 years to get the Navy on track to not only compete but win in this great power environment, okay? All right, thank you all very much.
CNO Richardson, thanks for participating in this afternoon's event, and please accept this gift as a small token of our appreciation.
Thank you so much. All right, thanks.
Thank you, sir. I think Alan's got a little engravement on there. Thanks, appreciate it. Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our luncheon. Thank you again to our sponsors, CACI and James by HS Market. Up next,